Hey everyone, my name is Nick, I'm the CEO of Doc, and welcome to another edition of Identi3, a podcast all about identity and Web3. And it is my absolute pleasure today to be joined by Gail Hodges. Amongst many things, Gail is the Exec Director of the OpenID Foundation. Thanks for joining us, Gail.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Nick.
Yeah, no problem at all. Yeah, I really appreciate your time. You've got, like I say, a really interesting profile. You've been in the identity space for a very long time. So without further ado, could you please introduce yourself?
I'd be happy to. So again, Gail Hodges. I have my main hat is acting as executive director of the OpenID Foundation, as you said. But I also have two other hats. With my second hat, I'm also an advisor to the California DMV, where I act as senior advisor on digital identity technologies. And with my third hat, which is basically all volunteer, I'm a co-organizer of the City Hub, which I think we'll talk about during the course of our comments. And that's a global community to really accelerate the work on digital identity infrastructure. So really excited to come and talk to you and your listeners about these topics.
Yeah, and you've got so many hats, you need multiple heads as well, it would seem. And so you're utterly immersed in the world of identity. What first got you interested in the space, Gail?
So it was probably when I was in HSBC. I spent 20 plus years in the financial services industry running credit and debit card portfolios and working on digital payments for American Express, Bank of America, and towards the end with HSBC. And as I was, on the board working on digital topics for HSBC, I could see all those direct linkages between identity and the dependency of digital infrastructure on identity, even though I was focused on the payment side of the house. And even at that point, I could see how chip-based architecture, when you're enabling a payment transaction like what we know now as an Apple Pay or a Google Pay transaction. Those didn't exist at that moment. But in those early stages, as things were migrating towards having a hardware-bound identity credential, a hardware-bound payment credential, that having a hardware-bound identity credential could be a natural evolution. But that would be one of the most difficult things to virtualize and to digitize. And so it might be that payments, as we saw, was one of the first, and then there were transit applications and loyalty card applications and a whole lot of things that we now kind of expect and find normal within wallets and being held on our devices. But digital identity credentials were going to be this huge hurdle to overcome, a new type of relationship between digital platforms and governments, and for governments to think about regulation. And so that was going to be really thorny. And so even back in kind of 2013, 2014, I thought this is, for me, a really interesting area. And when the opportunity came up with it at Apple to look into digital identity, what people might see now as ID and wallet, I put up my hand and said, I really want to work on that topic. So it was an exciting time to be at Apple working on it and getting to know so many of the thought leaders in the identity domain, and continuing to do that with my work now.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like it. And it's amazing how many people came into the space via payments. Quite a few of previous guests have come on that same route as well. And it appears that you're also have done that. You're, in addition to the executive director of the OpenID Foundation, you're the founder of the Future Identity Council. I understand that's kind of starting to kind of transition down. Excuse me. Could you tell our listeners a little bit about what the Future Identity Council, I guess, was or kind of is going to be, and also about your transition from that organization to the OpenID Foundation?
Yeah, definitely. When I was at Apple and in my decision to kind of leave Apple, what I saw was not just Apple, but like the private sector as a whole racing ahead with so much expertise and so much innovation around these technologies. But amongst the government stakeholders that I met with around the world and around the US, I was deeply troubled around the government bench strength. Right? There would definitely be some very capable people, but the breadth of individuals within an issuing authority, the breadth of individuals thinking about the regulatory impacts, thinking about how to operationalize this at scale, as just like the roads and the shipping lanes and the train lines that we have for physical infrastructure, like we simply didn't have the identity infrastructure that we needed to have to shore up our existing challenges like financial crime, and ability to share your medical records, or the list goes on in terms of use cases. But we didn't have the infrastructure to support our problems today, much less the emerging opportunities of cryptocurrencies or blockchains or now AI. Right. So we needed to kind of build that up. And I saw that massive delta between the private sector and the governments. And so what I saw is a huge opportunity. And I, consider myself issue driven, and clearly very passionate about this topic. I wanted to throw myself into the middle of that issue and try and address it. So when I left Apple, I actually I jumped off a cliff, as they sometimes say about being an entrepreneur. I jumped off the cliff, but without having a business that I was starting and without having a nonprofit that I was starting.
Yep.
I started a community called the Future Identity Council, which was designed to bring together the government stakeholders, the private sector stakeholders, and the nonprofit thought leaders in order to try and figure out what would some of the best practices be, the key principles that should inform how this ecosystem would emerge, not just in the US, but also from a global context. And so for the next 18 months, myself and a band of experts from a variety of organizations, AMVA here in the US is the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators. They volunteered a great deal of time to help co-chair a lot of these working groups. And we had 7 countries, 11 US states, and a handful of other nonprofits, including Kantara and AMVA and others. And I actually had reached out to the OpenID Foundation at that point, which I'll come back to. All took part in drafting these recommendations. And those recommendations subsequently were handed over to AMVA and were incorporated into their implementation guidelines for US issuing authorities and DMVs. And that is eventually going to be formalized through their digital trust service that they're putting in place to create a common high bar for US issuing authorities to say, hey, if you're part of this digital trust service, you followed a lot of these best practices. So that's going to help the relying party community and the ecosystem writ large and individuals to know that they're kind of taking part in something that's a higher quality for the US. There's not a difference between an Arizona and a California and a New York. There's a common high bar for what good would look like. Similarly, that work has gone into some work at Kantara with the PEMC, that's the Privacy Enhanced Mobile Credentials work. And I literally had someone reaching out to me this week around contributing some of that to Australia and to the EU. And that's something that we're working on doing. So that initial community group has disbanded as that work has been contributed elsewhere. And I personally picked up 2 new opportunities to deliver on my mission, as I mentioned. So with one hat, taking on the leadership and the executive director post for the OpenID Foundation, which is a technical standards body, and then also acting as an advisor to the California DMV.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, and that was a very brave move, kind of leaving, I'm sure, what is a very kind of, stressful, but also, a well-paying, structured job, and then moving into something that you knew you wanted to be in, but there, you had to create everything. So yeah, very brave move on your part, and obviously that demonstrates your passion for the space as well, Gail. Why do citizens need mobile identity credentials? We're reading a lot about it, particularly if you're involved in the identity space, you are as well. Why are people, why are individuals needing these identity credentials, and why also do they, of course, need to be private, secure, and easy to use?
Yeah. It's a great question, and I think it's one that the community is obviously struggling with because we don't really have it today, right? So it's hard to anticipate how much dependency and how much a capability could influence your life when it doesn't exist at the moment, or it barely exists. It's just in its infancy. So obviously today people have that framework in their mind. They're thinking about their physical identity credentials, like their passport and their driving license. And then maybe to some degree, they're thinking about digital identity credentials like, oh, I log in to different websites, or I'm, have a pass key. If you're technical, you're thinking I have a new capability like a pass key to get me access to services and to resources that I would like to get into, whether for my individual use or for my professional use. So we have these kind of norms that we've become well accustomed to. But when we think about the internet, when we think about digital services writ large, they're built on the back of very weak identity infrastructure, relatively weak ways of binding the carbon human person with that digital service that they're trying to get access to. And clearly there's the problems with trust. So how that manifests is obviously, for those of us who already participate in the formal economy, we put together the tools we have. We have our 1Passwords, we have our Apple devices with our keychain, to kind of make it easier for us to access services. And then if we are applying for a bank account, maybe we're already known with a credit history. And so it might be relatively straightforward, the 30 seconds to a minute to open up a new credit card, or even be able to open up a new bank account online by doing things like scanning that physical credential, or mailing off information that can be checked remotely. But generally, when we start to do those remote transactions, then the risk that there could be a compromise and a bad actor who tries to intervene is going to scale. And we feel that with things like in our daily lives, having identity theft, daily lives, having financial crimes and issues like that. What I think people often miss is the woods for the trees, that because of that porous digital attack infrastructure, we're seeing that scale of financial crime and all the businesses that are built off the back of that. So it's something like 1.4 trillion, I think, in global, financial crime and cybercrime. And in the US, the Treasury Department through FinCEN just recently released a report of $212 billion worth of US financial crime based on reports into FinCEN from financial institutions that directly attribute the financial crime to a compromise in that identity transaction, weakness in identity, the ability for the bank to identify the individual effectively, or in the financial institution or the individual being able to know that the counterparty who's receiving the funds, that there's an issue with the entity that's receiving the funds. So somewhere within that chain, there's been a compromise in identity. So if we are able to, step back and say these are identity related problems, how do you get to the root of solving those by empowering people with that digital identity credential that can change their lives in small ways, more friction-free ways? If you lose your password and you have to go through step-up authentication, can you make it easier to use a digital credential that you might have on your device, for example, to get access back into those resources? Can you have better caregiving models for how you have authority over someone else you're providing care for, be that a child or be that a senior? And authorize transactions and set that model up to be more secure. Government services, obviously, and more widely, there's any transaction where you need to assert your age over a certain level for restricted goods, or other transactions in person, like entering a stadium or knowing that the person who purchased a ticket is the same person who's entering a venue. So there's a very wide range of use cases that could become relevant to the users.
Yeah. I think as well that's what makes this so hard. Like when you're trying to kind of architect a system and design standards and things like that for it, it's really tricky because not only are you trying to think about all the edge cases and security risks and fraudsters and things like that, you're also trying to extend its use to make it as useful as possible, whilst at the same time making sure that mom and pop can use this stuff as well. And that's the other hard part. It's going through the UX aspects of it, that we don't end up with just a highly technical solution that's secure, but actually when no one knows how to use it, or the learning curve is too steep. So hats off for taking on what I'm sure is a very rewarding but very challenging kind of role in all of this. How is the OpenID Foundation, obviously a big part of the remit of that organization, Gail, is working with governments and also the private sector. And many people obviously think of identity as a public good. How are you working with these organizations to make sure that this amazing technology can reach its full potential?
Yeah. I think it's just kind of coming into the discourse now, right, Nick? This concept of a public good, that digital identity is a public good, because again, we just kind of take it for granted today. Like individuals or residents in a jurisdiction have a social contract with their government. And part of the way that social contract is manifest is that some sort of physical credential usually is kind of memorializing that and saying, you get access to these services, from the government. The government's obliged to give you as a resident these types of capabilities. And then that same credential then gets used in our daily lives, right? For the financial services, for the healthcare, for, the retail capabilities, or buying a drink, right? Such a range of things. And so the governments play this natural role in the issuance of the credentials and the acceptance of credentials for government services, as well as the regulation of those services. But of course, all of that has been predicated on usually physical credentials or a digital login to get access to your government services. And it hasn't yet gone through this step function change like other things have to really truly digitize the end-to-end transaction. And so as we are doing this, personally, I'm involved in the government conversations in all three of my hats and in various different capacities, and not just one government, loads of government. So it's a complex framework. But for the OpenID Foundation, what the board, determined, about 2 years ago as part of the strategy was that it was important for a standards body to be closer to the decision makers who would be opining on, would they choose to build something completely in-house with their own tech stack, which is what you might see with an Aadhaar or a Singapore, early movers who've created a lot of the core capabilities they need within their jurisdiction, or is that country contemplating using open standards or, even, private APIs by a private institution? Like what are the governments doing in the way that they choose to design their architecture? And that we thought as the board, it was important to be closer to those decision makers to make sure that they had the facts available to them and could make informed choices. And so, from an OpenID Foundation perspective, we would say, here we have these great, robust standards that are tested to be secure end to end. We have these robust standards, which when you deploy them, they're going to allow interoperability between all the players in an ecosystem. You can avoid all those point-to-point integrations by doing a single integration, and then you can certify conformance to it. And it's all for, low price of free for the ability to access the standards. There's no cost. And then in terms of certification, we intentionally make it incredibly low cost. The tests are free. You can run them as you like. And then if you choose to certify, then there's a modest cost, cost plus, as it were, to kind of have your implementation formally certified. And so that's in keeping with the OpenID Foundation's mission and vision to help people assert their identity wherever they would like to, and to work with the community to develop standards that are going to be private and secure and interoperable. And so helping those governments make those informed decisions is key. And we probably work directly with about 10 countries. Sometimes with more skewed to digital identity, sometimes more skewed to open banking and open data. But those are the places where they tend to need our help the most. Pretty much every government is using OpenID Foundation standards like OpenID Connect to enable the more classical integrated transaction. And that could be for gaining access to your government services, for example, that they might have done an initial deployment, or for sharing your medical records, like what Norway has done. They use our standards. But as we get into this newer world of digital identity credentials, I can go deeper into this, but one of our standards called the Digital Credentials Protocols Working Group, DCP Working Group, is the family of the OpenID for Verifiable Credentials family of specs. And together with one of our other working groups, but there's some robust work which has been incorporated into the EU Digital Identity Wallet. It's been incorporated into the California DMV wallet. The Japanese government has been funding tests, for the development of this. And so the OpenID Foundation is in the middle of and directly partnering with governments that are thinking about their digital identity standards, as well as their open banking and open data standards, and also just kind of like their day-to-day work. So we seek to be of service to them as they go through their due diligence and then their deployment due process.
Yeah. It almost seems like you're everywhere. And I know that Doc use OpenID Connect within our solution, but it does seem that your standards are very well adopted and incorporated. And interesting, we'll actually kind of dig into a question that I'm particularly interested in towards, in a few moments' time around standards and competing standards as well. But yeah, it sounds like you guys are doing a ton of different stuff across, government and private sector. Shifting speed a little bit into, you mentioned at the start, Gail, with the intro, working at Apple, and which I think is interesting to most people because obviously a very large, very powerful, very profitable company, and they're so woven into most of our lives if you're within that ecosystem. You were involved in the start of the project that enables users to add driver's licenses to their Apple wallets, which, I certainly use Apple Wallet, but unfortunately in the UK we don't have driver's licenses that are mobile and digital yet. And that project was called ID and Wallet, like you mentioned at the start. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, please?
Sure. Yeah, it's Apple's a fantastic place to work. Great deal of respect to my former peers, and it was a great four and a half, almost 5 years, that I was working at Apple, in what was then the Apple Pay team, then working on things around payments and issuing credentials to banks, or helping banks issue credentials to users in Latin America, and then getting involved in digital identity. Shortly after joining Apple. The journey as a Apple is an interesting place in terms of the sausage making of developing new capabilities, but it was part of the vision of Apple from the beginning, to basically replace the wallet, right? The Tim Cook put up on a screen, a picture of a wallet and said, we think this fat wallet, we can get rid of that one, and so if you look at the kind of life cycle of what the Apple Wallet team had done, kind of individual credentials were getting like checked off of that list, and then a big one that was missing was digital identity. So I was lucky to be on the team, and a core part of that due diligence on how to think about, if one were to digitize a credential, how to go about it. And without going too much into the due process, I think you see with the way that it's been launched since then, the using the TSA as a champion use case, to say this is something which at least a decent population of users understand. They're going to be presenting their credential at a time when it's super stressful. You're like me, I've got two young kids. You're juggling kids, you're juggling bags, and you're juggling your identity credential. It makes it that little bit easier to have a digital version of that credential that you can present. And then what could give people more trust, than to know that there's a transparent process with the TSA where they're legally bound to only take a limited amount of information from that identity credential, and that they're going to put in place a rigorous process to check that credential, and then the user is going to have an elegant experience, because they don't want to have something that slows down their TSA line, right? They want it to be a rapid transaction to present, and they know it's inevitable that people are going to start coming to the airport with those digital versions of credentials, not a physical credential. So they need to be prepared, or they have an operational problem on their hands with all these digital credentials showing up, that they wouldn't be able to consume. And they tend to be like very technology forward in trying to understand new technologies like biometrics that they can incorporate, and adopt that, or conform it to law. So working with a kind of key player like that, as well as with many of the different jurisdictions and many of the key vendors, to think about the end-to-end journey and how to approach it in a way that would be secure, privacy preserving, and easy, was a really fun effort. And of course, like you and I have said, Nick, there are many different use cases. So you can imagine within a place like Apple, lots of different use cases, being a point of conversation. And so we've really just it's the tip of the iceberg, what we see today around what a mobile driving license like an ID and wallet can do, compared to like how it can be effectively part of our lives in the seamless way, a bit like currencies are. You kind of expect your dollars to be virtualized and to be able to present them and spend with a debit or credit card very easily within your country and across countries. And you expect the same with your passport. You expect to be able to present your passport when you cross borders and it to just work, right? Or present it to a hotel and it just works as representing who you are with a high level of trust and authority. When we move to digital credentials, we obviously have a lot of change management to think about to make that real jump and to get all the players in the ecosystem equally comfortable with the trust in the process, as well as with the technical integrations that are necessary to drive that adoption.
And I suppose as well, what makes that extremely tricky is just the sheer scale it's involved in as well, and the absolute differing technical capability of all the different stakeholders. I mean, I would imagine you get some customs that are very probably tuned in technologically, and others that are less so. So I think, it's just going to take a long time to roll out, isn't it? But I suppose, we are in effect replacing a system that's existed for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So we should expect it to take a little bit of time to put something new in place. I think that's only fair. I'm quite a big fan of...
It could take time.
Go ahead.
I think one of the key questions, Nick, is like, how can one collapse it, right? So the way that I would look at it is, let's say if it was left completely up to organic processes And, it's just each individual organization saying, what's my cost benefit for why I'm going to deploy this little bit of kit, right? To provide it to my services, my clients, or to provide it to, to consume it as an individual, then that could be, let's call it 20 years, right? Like a really long time to see a material scale adoption. But if you flip the script and you say the challenges that we're facing as a society, like the issues with AI and deep fakes and not having a high confident way of identifying who the individual or entity is on the other side of a transaction and vice versa, if you say you're really, concerned about the financial crime, the national security issues associated with what financial crime is funding, as well as other challenges around communications and trust on the internet, even with social media, there are so many challenges that are basically problematic because of that lack of digital identity infrastructure. So if you were to reframe it and say from a political leader perspective, from a CEO perspective, identity is critical infrastructure for my organization, and it impacts the quality of my users' experience if I can do it better, and it helps me reduce my costs if I can deploy it faster because can be a lower cost credential for me to consume compared to a per transaction Experian call or something like that. If I can improve my experience, reduce my costs, prepare for the future, you start to get into a different strategic set of decisions on why it becomes an imperative to get even that 1, 2, 3 people in your organization thinking about, what is this technology? How can I consume this standard? How do I incorporate this into my use case, into my experience? What's the most important use case for me? And just starting to chip away at it at that bottoms up individual organization level, but also top down strategically, where is the US national strategy, right? To allow for the acceleration of digital identity infrastructure. And, do there need to be nudges to ensure that the right adoption is encouraged? That's antithetical to how we in the US sometimes think about it, but when in other jurisdictions like in the EU, you see substantial investments in making sure that there is an interoperable way across the European countries to build the infrastructure and to develop the use cases with the large-scale pilots and to prove that out and to incentivize it with strategic investments. And of course, there are many other country examples we can give, including Adhar with their billion users, who are getting scale access to government services. So there's a real spectrum, and there's tens of different national deployments, some public-led, some private-led, and they're all moving simultaneously. So it's not a matter of, is it coming? It's already here. And then the question is whether your individual organization, are you prepared? Are you on a track? Is your strategy and your roadmap thinking about and contemplating how to build it in so you can converge to some of these capabilities yourselves?
Yeah, very good. And do you find that nudging that you mentioned, Gail, do you find that that's, again, something that you consider the remit of the OpenID Foundation, just that kind of gentle nudging towards government and large enterprise to make sure they're aware of all the things that are coming up and to make sure that they're prepared?
So the OpenID Foundation is a technical standards body. It's not a lobbying or a policy organization at all. So as I said before, our kind of way of thinking is like mission and vision led. To help users present their credentials and to work with the community to make sure it's private and secure, and of course to offer up our standards to be one of the ways to solve that. But one of the things that can be lost is that no single standards body can do all of this. No single private entity can do all of this, and no single government can do all of this. And that's actually one of the insights behind a community-led initiative called the City Hub. Maybe this is a good time to kind of jump into it.
Please, yeah, go. It's nice segue.
And share a little bit more around that effort. So I mentioned those of us who are in the middle of this, and you would know this as well, Nick, is such an expert, is that because no one entity can do it all, right? It's like literally no one knows exactly how to deploy global digital identity infrastructure that's going to work everywhere for everyone, and to do that in a much faster time frame than it has taken to roll out, let's say, credit card infrastructure globally, so that feels like totally seamless. Or the same thing with passports, right? Where the airline industry pushed passport interoperability so that there would be easier for travelers and processing travelers across borders, and eventually that led to ICAO governing that infrastructure. So what is the process we should put in place? So the coming out of ID for Africa last year, which is arguably the preeminent conference around identity in Africa, I attended for the very first time, delighted to be invited to attend there. But having the benefit of meeting so many subject matter experts on identity in the development community, and coming from a background of working at digital platforms, at major banks, and working with the board of the OpenID Foundation, it was very obvious to me and some of the other nonprofit leaders that I met that there was this enormous gulf between the global north and the global south. There was some consistency in some of the standards that were being chosen, but we weren't exactly on a path to say that we're all marching towards interoperability that's just going to work at some point. It's the opposite, right? Because individual countries will say, what are my requirements? How should my tech stack work? What do my stakeholder groups need? What do my residents need? And they kind of think about interoperability as this kind of downstream thing. Like, I need interoperability within my jurisdiction, and maybe I mandate it and maybe I don't. But like, I don't necessarily have to worry right away around how to do a cross-border transaction with identity to another continent. Maybe some of them will think about their neighbors, and there'll be some regional federations and so forth. But it's very, very limited, the degree to which interoperability is ready to roll. And so we said this is a problem, right? We're not on a path to convergence. There's global north and global south. There's kind of politics within the global south. There's kind of politics and like bun fights in technologies in the global north. But if you actually put them together, there's a collective problem. And that kind of breaks some of the existing boundaries of the debates that are going on, which is that ultimately we're as experts, we share this problem. And if we as a community of subject matter experts can't see the solution, then how on earth could we imagine that some multilateral, bilateral policy coming down from on high is going to magically solve all of these issues for us? So as experts, we need to come together and first confirm that there's a problem. Do we believe that interoperability of digital identity credentials is a material issue, and one that we need to tackle in this kind of transparent way with the private sector, with the nonprofits, with the multilaterals, with the countries, and not in any way remove the sovereignty of individual governments or remove the natural role of the multilaterals, but ensure that there's a safe space to discuss where are the gaps, what are the challenges, and how do we coordinate our efforts to close them and get onto a convergence path. So I won't say which country, but I was talking to a very digital forward country a couple of weeks back who already has digital identity infrastructure, and they're like, okay, we've got what we need. But of course, they can't interoperate with all the other countries, and their users can't travel abroad and use these credentials. So they're interested in convergence, right? It's like a natural evolution for them. If you're another country who barely has coverage of digital identity, physical credentials, then you're kind of thinking about that first before you get on to what digital credential infrastructure do I need and how do I do interoperability for those digital identity credentials. But that doesn't mean that even those individuals, call it a South Sudan, for example, that they don't want to have the opportunity to get involved in providing their requirements, right? And there's also a challenge. Let's say you're a digital platform, you will often serve a home jurisdiction or the higher income countries before you're thinking about the requirements, or you even have the capacity to gather the requirements from all of the different jurisdictions. So City Hub is on a path. It currently comprises 22 countries, 25 nonprofits, and all of the main multilaterals, the OECD, the World Bank, the UN, the African Union, the European Union, and a bunch of private entities are participating with their nonprofit hats or with their standards bodies hats to have this safe space. We brought the first group together of 120 targeted individuals to try and validate the problem last November in Paris. It was very well attended, very good result. 92% of the attendees said this is a real problem and one we need to continue working on into 2024. And so we started the program to develop a strategy based on the feedback of that group and where they saw the natural challenge was to achieving interoperability, and created 5 work streams. And we're going to have 5 workshops and summits this year. The 5 work streams are kind of chronological to some degree. Well, the first 3 are. So the first one is champion use cases. What are the ultimate kind of champion use cases for cross-border presentation of digital identity? identity. We realize that there's no natural home for that to be decided, right? The EU might have their champion use cases, but do the rest of the world agree that those are the champion use cases for them? Maybe not, right? Can NIST together with EU and their TPP come up with champion use cases that the rest of the world is going to agree are going to be the same? Probably not. And if you took just what, let's say, a regional coalition within Africa and said their use cases are what all global South, countries need, that they're not going to come up with the right answer either. So we can work together to try and go through a methodical process of evaluating use cases and trying to identify 1, 2, 3 use cases that could set the building blocks and the foundations for that interoperability, and then continue to extend it out from there so we can serve more and more use cases. So that's the first work stream. The second one is minimum requirements for digital identity interoperability. So that's the usual thing, right? When you're a startup or you're a larger corporation, like, what are the minimum requirements? What have I got to get done? And in this case, it's around, if you're trying to serve a particular use case, what are the technical requirements of that stack in order to even have a basic transaction between a couple countries or multiple countries? So how do we drill that down into a baseline set of requirements that set those first building blocks? The third work stream is trust framework mapping. There's some fantastic work by the Open Identity Exchange, one of our peer nonprofits, on mapping 7 different jurisdictions and their current identity trust frameworks so that you can speak a common language. And when a user comes from another jurisdiction and tries to present it, there's even an idea of whether you can consume it or not for the use case the user is trying to use it for. So can you buy a drink or can you not buy a drink, right? Do you trust the credential enough to even be able to try a drink? Or can you present the credential to get registered into a hotel? Whatever the use case might be. So mapping the trust frameworks is a big piece of the puzzle. Then we have metrics of success. What are we trying to do? I mean, in my opinion, it's 8 billion people on the planet should have access to digital identity credentials, but what does the community think, our goals should be, and what are the KPIs and the way of breaking that down? A bit like a UN development goal, right? Like, the UN's not going to set this goal. They have a development goal for physical credentials, but what does the community believe good looks like, to move faster? And then the last work stream is on governance. How do we're a community. We're not a real entity. We're not not government-led or quasi-led or NGO. Like, it's just a community. But there will be some decisions that need to still be made in the absence of a natural home for those decisions, right? So how do we think about decision-making? If we find that there's a structural gap, how do we think about the requirements to solve that governance issue over time? And then we'll have 5 conversations this year on 5 continents to make it easy for some of these experts to convene together, and then to have a video participation for those who can't travel to take part. So we're seeking to have a day before ID for Africa this May to bring together mostly the African community and global stakeholders. The day before the European Cloud and Identity Conference, we'll have a day in Berlin to bring together European stakeholders in the global group. Then we'll have one in either Tokyo or Singapore in October. Oh, I missed one. In September, we'll look to have one in Washington, D.C. Then in October would be either Tokyo or Singapore. And then that builds up to the G20 in November, where we'll look to have one alongside the G20, where digital identity and data sharing are 2 of the themes which we think are likely to come up there.
Wow. I mean, that seems like an awful lot of work. So an awful lot of organization. So yeah, it seems like an extremely involved thing to be part of, but extremely rewarding as well. Yeah. Gail, you're also a special advisor amongst the many hats that you're wearing, the 3 hats that you're wearing. A big part of that's the special advisor to the identity technologies of the California DMV. What are the benefits that you see for digital driver's licenses around that initiative?
Well, one of the exciting things is that the residents in California are already voting with their feet without any major PR, blasts to take out these credentials. So there are over 300,000 Californians walking around with digital identity credentials already. There's the support of the legislature with the pilot, which is allowing up to 1.5 million people to take part. And hopefully, we'll see that will be lifted soon in order to expand the number of Californians that can participate. And we see a great deal of interest, of course, from the digital platforms that have their home in California, like Apple and Google, who have been issuing digital identity credentials. And the public plan from the state of California, I'm not saying anything confidential here, is to give users their choice, right? And to give them the choice of the wallet that they would like to use to present their credential, and to complete this pilot and understand, what good looks like in terms of the daily life as well as the digital life of presenting these credentials. So it's an exciting time for the state of California. We think other departments within California are going to find this to be quite valuable to deliver on their own missions. And we think there'll be a lot of adoption from whether it's startups or the large scale players to start consuming these credentials. And of course, it's not just California. There's multiple other US states who have interoperable credentials. So I won't list them all out, but you have Georgia, you have Iowa and Utah and a variety, Arizona, like Maryland. There are many states who have already gone live. And, to me, it's important. It's bipartisan, right? There's different flavors of states. But they're pursuing a common approach to serve Americans and to make sure that the residents of their states have what they need. And of course, they're ensuring that they're going to have a secure and as private a solution as possible. So it's on a very good trajectory, even if it's still in the early stages here in the U.S. and in the absence of that national strategy, which I think would be very valuable to help accelerate the benefits.
Yeah. And there's obviously kind of individuals benefiting. How do you see kind of businesses benefiting from driver's licenses, Gail? We've often talked as we've gone through this conversation about it being important that there's multiple use cases for identity credentials. They shouldn't just do like government stuff or private business use cases. What are you seeing as the biggest opportunities for businesses in California?
So the range of use cases is so broad. What I usually advise is that depending on your role, your remit, kind of also what you're interested in, what does it mean for your work, for your organization, and for yourself personally, right? So for some people who are just listening to this and tripping over the content, they might find that they could get a digital identity credential in their state and they want to learn more about it, and they can download it and then, start to use it maybe for travel with TSA, maybe for online presentation with apps, and they can start to get familiar with the technology as individuals. Then, if you happen to be working for, running a small bar, right? Can your bar people be able to have an app on their phone, a reader device, in order to be able to start accepting these credentials that people have if they've forgotten their physical credential? We're expecting, younger people who want to assert their identity, whether it's at convenience stores, to start presenting at convenience stores or at bars and clubs, because they're walking around with their devices anyway, sometimes without their identity credential or with their identity credential tucked into the back. So this is kind of like forward looking for those really small merchants. Then if you're a startup and you're a startup that has a dependency on digital identity, could this fit in your roadmap? Are you a really great innovator and you want to be able to adopt new technology and have that part of your messaging, to your client base, that you can consume these credentials? The standards are coming for that online presentation, some from the OpenID Foundation, which is exciting for those startups to consume. And then if you're in a more mature organization, whether it's a government entity or in a more mature relying party like a bank or a retail organization, it's probably going to fit into your world as well. And where does it fit in? How might you consume the technology? Clearly listening to podcasts like this is keeping you up the curve on what's new. But how do you incorporate that into the strategy and the roadmap for yourself and your team to understand the technology, understand the benefits to your own business, your own use case, and then start that plan to get the job done? It's a very welcoming community, and there's a huge amount of work to get done. And so we need the volunteering, we need people to spin up their effort, and there will be opportunities like hackathons coming in the future, some hosted by government, some hosted by the private sector. So there'll be opportunities for people to get their hands dirty with the code and with their peers, learning how to make great use cases come to life.
Yeah, fantastic. Great advice. And I know we've kind of run over time. A load more questions I would have loved to us get through, but there was so much packed content in there that I don't feel that bad about it. Is there anything that you wanted to end on as we wrap up here, Gail? Any kind of piece of advice or any kind of last comment you'd like to make to our listeners about identity or the opportunities it presents?
Well, maybe I'll at least kind of give a shout out to some of the places to find out more
Fantastic.
on some of this work. So for the OpenID Foundation at openid.net, is the home of the OpenID Foundation. So please come and find out more about the specifications around the work that's underway, our community groups and our work groups. You are more than welcome. It's free to participate in the OpenID Foundation. You're signing a contribution agreement, and feel free to weigh in. In California, if you search for a California DMV wallet, you'll get to the homepage, and Californians will be able can now download a California DMV wallet and go through the process to provision that credential and start using it right away. So please do that if you're a Californian, or if you're curious around how California is approaching this, or you might be interested in being able to accept one of those California credentials. It's all based on open standards, and you can configure as a relying party configure to be able to accept it. And then in the third case for City Hub, that's the Sustainable and Interoperable Digital Identity Hub. It's SIDI-hub.community, so city-hub.community. You can find out more and get on the dissemination list for more information around what's coming out from the City Hub efforts. We want to make sure we have great thought leaders and experts like those listening to your podcast, Nick, weighing in and helping to drive this global effort.
Oh, of course, fantastic. And yeah, we'll put these links in the show notes as well, so that people can hopefully easily access these amazing resources. But Gail,
Great.
You've been absolutely an absolute pleasure to have on the show. It's been fantastic to hear all the knowledge that you've got to bring and all the experience. So I very much appreciate the time that you've taken, and I hope to speak to you again very soon. But Gail, thanks for coming on Identi3.
Great, thanks for having me.
All right, thank you.